she was the first person to see him alive again, the first human being on earth to know that Jesus had risen from the dead. And then she had to figure out how to live the rest of her life. Mary Magdalene. We know her from one unforgettable morning. The morning she went to the tomb in the dark, found it empty, and became the first witness of the resurrection. But her story did not end that morning. She lived on for years, for decades perhaps, after Jesus died and rose and finally ascended into heaven. And almost no one ever asks what those years were like. Because here is what we forget. Mary Magdalene loved Jesus more deeply than almost anyone. He had changed her life completely. The Gospels tell us he freed her from a terrible affliction, and from that moment she followed him, supported him, and stayed with him to the very end. When the male disciples fled at the cross, she stayed. When he was buried, she watched. And when the Sabbath was over, she went back to his tomb in the dark because she could not stay away. She loved him that much. So when he was gone, truly gone, ascended into heaven, how did a woman who loved him that much go on living? What did she do with the rest of her life? How do you live day after ordinary day after you have seen the risen Lord with your own eyes and then watched him leave? In this video, we are going to live inside the life of Mary Magdalene after Jesus died. The morning that changed everything. The being left behind when he ascended. How she lived in the early years of the church. Her daily life, her grief, her devotion, and the long, faithful years she lived carrying the most extraordinary memory any human being has ever carried. We are going to rebuild her life after the loss and step inside it. A note before we begin. The Gospels tell us a great deal about Mary Magdalene up to the resurrection, but very little about her later life, which is known mainly through various and sometimes conflicting traditions. So much of this is a careful reconstruction. And one thing we will set straight. The popular idea that she was a prostitute is not in the Bible at all. It is a later mistake, and we will not repeat it. Where we are imagining, we will say so. It begins with the morning that made her famous, and the impossible things she saw in the dawn. To understand how Mary Magdalene lived after Jesus died, you have to understand what he was to her, and what she lost when he was gone. The Gospels tell us that Jesus had freed her from a terrible affliction. 7 demons, the text says, however we understand that. Whatever it was, it had tormented her, and he had set her free. And from that moment, her life was utterly changed. She became one of his most devoted followers. The Gospel of Luke tells us that she, along with other women, traveled with Jesus and the disciples and supported them out of their own resources. She gave her life to following him. He had given her back her life, and she spent the rest of it in gratitude and devotion. Think about what that kind of love is. He had saved her, not in some abstract way, but really personally, from whatever had been destroying her. He had given her back her mind, her freedom, her life. There is no gratitude deeper than that. And she poured it all into following him, serving him, staying near him. He was not just her teacher. He was her rescuer, the one who had given her everything. Her whole new life was built around him. And that is why, when the end came, she did not run. The Gospels make a point of telling us who stayed at the cross when Jesus was crucified. And most of the male disciples are not on the list. They had fled, scattered, hidden in fear. But the women stayed. And Mary Magdalene is named among them, again and again. She stood near the cross and watched him die. She did not look away. She did not abandon him in his agony. The love that had followed him everywhere stayed with him to the very end. And she stayed even after death. The Gospels tell us she watched where his body was laid. She saw the tomb. She marked the place. And she intended to come back when the Sabbath was over, to care for his body, to anoint it properly, the last act of love she could offer. Even in death, she would not leave him. She would tend him one more time. Think about what that resolve reveals about her love. The man was dead. There was, by every ordinary measure, nothing left to do. Most people, in their grief and fear, would have stayed away, would have let the body be, would have hidden like the other disciples were hiding. But Mary Magdalene could not. Her love would not let her abandon him, even as a corpse. She would go back, at first light, and do the last tender thing she could for the body of the man who had saved her. That is the measure of her devotion, that it reached past death itself, that even a sealed tomb could not keep her from coming to care for him one final time. So picture her grief on that terrible Sabbath, the day after the crucifixion. The man who had saved her, who had given her back her life, who had been the center of everything for her, was dead, sealed in a tomb, gone. The whole new life she had built around him had collapsed in a single afternoon. She had lost not just a teacher, but her rescuer, her purpose, the person her entire world revolved around. Anyone who has lost the person their life was built around knows the particular devastation of that. Mary Magdalene lived it on that Sabbath, in the dark. And so, the moment the Sabbath ended and the first light of Sunday came, she did what love does. She went back to him. While it was still dark, she made her way to the tomb. She could not stay away. And what she found there would change not just her life, but the history of the world. It was still dark when she came to the tomb that Sunday morning. The Gospel of John tells the story with the intimacy of an eyewitness. Mary Magdalene came while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been rolled away. Her first thought was not resurrection. How could it be? She thought someone had taken the body. In her grief, the empty tomb was not a miracle. It was one more horror, one more loss. They had taken him. She could not even tend his body now. She ran to tell the others, distraught. They have taken the Lord, and we do not know where they have laid him. And then she came back to the tomb, and she stood outside it, weeping. This is one of the most human moments in all the Gospels. She is not expecting a miracle. She is simply a grieving woman, standing outside an empty grave, crying, because the body of the man she loved is gone, and she does not even know where. Pure, raw grief. And then someone spoke to her. She thought it was the gardener. Through her tears, she did not recognize him. He asked her why she was weeping, who she was looking for. And she begged him, "If you have taken him, tell me where and I will take him away." She just wanted to find the body. She just wanted him back. And then he said one word, her name, Mary. And in that instant, she knew. The voice, the way he said her name. It was him, alive, standing in front of her. The man she had watched die, whose tomb she had come to weep at, alive, speaking her name in the dawn. She cried out, "Rabboni, teacher." And she must have moved to embrace him, to hold on to him, to never let him go again. Think about what this moment was for her. She had lost everything. She had come to a grave in the dark to weep. And instead, she found him alive. The deepest grief any person can feel, turned in a single instant into the greatest joy any person has ever felt. From the bottom of loss to the top of joy, in the space of a spoken name. No one in history has ever had a morning like the one Mary Magdalene had. And notice how he reached her. Not with a sermon, not with a proof, not with a display of power. He simply said her name. The most personal thing one person can say to another. He knew her individually, completely, and he called her by name, and that was enough. That is how she knew it was really him, by the intimacy of it, by the way he said the one word that was hers. Of all the ways the risen Christ could have first revealed himself to the world, he chose to do it by gently speaking the name of one grieving woman in a garden. And she would carry the sound of her own name, spoken in that voice, for the rest of her life. And then Jesus gave her something extraordinary. He told her to go and tell the others, to go to the disciples and announce that he was alive. And so Mary Magdalene became the first person to proclaim the resurrection, the first preacher of the most important news in history. A woman in a world that often did not even count a woman's testimony, chosen to be the first witness, the first to carry the news that would change the world. She ran to the disciples and said the words no one had ever said before. "I have seen the Lord." That was her great moment, the morning she will always be remembered for. But that morning was not the end of her life. It was, in a sense, the beginning of the rest of it. Because after the resurrection appearances ended, after Jesus ascended into heaven, Mary Magdalene had to do what everyone who has had a mountaintop moment must do. She had to come back down and live an ordinary life, carrying an extraordinary memory. For a little while after the resurrection, Jesus appeared to his followers, to Mary, to the disciples, to many others. For 40 days, the impossible was real, and he was among them. But then came the ascension. He was lifted up, and a cloud took him from their sight. And he was gone, not dead this time, but returned to heaven, beyond where they could follow. And for Mary Magdalene, this was a second goodbye. She had lost him once to death, and been given him back. And now she had to let him go again. To heaven this time. She would not see his face again in this life. The man who had saved her, whom she had followed everywhere, whom she had grieved and then found alive, was gone again in a different way. And this time, there would be no resurrection morning. This time, he was gone for the rest of her life. So how does a person live after that? After you have followed the Son of God, watched him die, seen him risen, and then watched him ascend. After the most extraordinary events in human history are behind you, and ordinary life stretches ahead. This is the question of Mary Magdalene's later life. And the answer, as far as we can reconstruct it, is deeply moving. Because she did not drift away. She did not fade into the background and stop believing. The book of Acts shows us that after the ascension, the followers of Jesus, including the faithful women, gathered together in Jerusalem, praying, waiting, and then receiving the Spirit and becoming the early church. Mary Magdalene was part of that. She had been there at the cross, at the tomb, at the resurrection. She was woven into the very founding of the movement. She did not leave. She stayed, and she helped build what came next. Imagine her role in those early years. She was a living eyewitness, not just to the teaching of Jesus, but to the resurrection itself. She was the woman who had seen him alive first, who had spoken with him in the garden, who had carried the first news. As the church grew, as new believers came in, her testimony was a treasure. People would have wanted to hear it from her own lips. What was it like? What did he say? How did you know it was him? She was a primary witness to the central event of the faith. Her memory of that morning became part of the foundation of Christianity. And consider the particular weight her witness carried in that time and place. In the world she lived in, the testimony of a woman was often not even accepted as valid in a court of law. And yet Jesus had chosen a woman, had chosen her, to be the very first witness of the most important event in history, and to be the first to carry the news to the apostles themselves. There is something quietly revolutionary in that, and Mary Magdalene lived it out. She, whose word the world might have dismissed, became the founding witness of a faith that would spread across the entire world. She stood as living proof that in this new movement, the people the world overlooked were exactly the ones God chose to carry the greatest news. And her daily life would have been the life of a devoted member of that early community. The believers, Acts tells us, shared their lives, meeting together, breaking bread, praying, caring for one another, supporting those in need. Mary Magdalene, who had once supported Jesus and the disciples out of her own resources, would have continued that life of service and devotion. The daily rhythm of prayer, of community, of caring for others, of keeping the memory and the message of Jesus alive. Her devotion did not end when he ascended. It simply changed shape, from following him on the roads of Galilee to serving his people in the growing church. And this is one of the most important things to understand about how she lived after he died. Her love for him did not fade with time, and it did not curdle into despair when he was gone. It transformed into a life of faithful service. The gratitude that had made her follow him now made her serve his people. The devotion that had kept her at the cross now kept her in the community he had left behind. She loved him by loving what he loved. That is how she lived after he was gone, not by clinging to grief, but by pouring her love into the people and the mission he had left behind. Let us live inside the texture of her later years. The traditions about where she spent them vary. Some hold that she went with the Apostle John and Mary, the mother of Jesus, to Ephesus. The Western tradition holds that she traveled far to the west, to southern France, and spent her last years there in prayer and solitude. The Eastern tradition holds she lived and died near Ephesus. We cannot be certain. But across all the traditions, one thing is constant. She lived out her years in deep devotion to the Lord she had loved and lost and seen again. So picture her daily life, in whatever quiet place she spent her final years. Like any devout person of her world, her day would have been shaped by prayer. Morning prayer, the Psalms she knew by heart, the quiet conversation with God that had become the center of her life. And in her prayers, surely, the memory of that morning, the empty tomb, the spoken name, the risen Lord in the dawn. She had something to pray about that no one else had. She had seen him. Every prayer she prayed for the rest of her life was prayed by a woman who had spoken with the risen Christ in a garden. That memory would have been the burning center of her devotion, and there would have been the work of the day, whatever form it took. The simple tasks of living, the service to others, the care for the community, or, in some traditions, a life of prayerful solitude. But always, woven through it, the devotion, the keeping of the memory, the telling of the story to any who would hear it, the quiet faithfulness of a woman whose whole life had been transformed by one person, and who never stopped being grateful, never stopped being devoted for the rest of her days. And think about what it meant for her to grow older, carrying that memory. The years would have passed. The early church would have grown and spread. New generations of believers would have come along who had never seen Jesus, never heard him teach, never witnessed anything firsthand. And there, among them, was an old woman who had walked with him, who had stood at his cross, who had seen him risen. As she aged, she became more and more precious, a living bridge back to the events themselves. One of the last people on earth who could say I was there. The young believers would have treasured her, sat at her feet, asked her to tell it once more. And she would have, again and again, her old eyes lighting up at the memory of that morning in the garden. And there would have been grief, too, mixed in with the devotion. We should not pretend otherwise. Because she missed him. Of course she missed him. She had loved him with her whole heart, and he was gone, ascended beyond her reach, for the rest of her life. There would have been evenings when the longing was sharp, when she remembered his voice, his face, the way he had said her name in the garden. The ache of loving someone who is gone does not disappear just because you know they are alive in heaven. Mary Magdalene carried that ache surely for the rest of her life. The longing to see him again, to hear her name spoken by that voice once more. And there is something almost unbearably poignant in that particular longing of hers. Because she alone, of all the grieving people in the world, knew exactly what she was waiting for. Most people who lose someone can only imagine and hope what reunion might be like. Mary Magdalene knew. She had already had one impossible reunion, in a garden, at dawn, when she thought he was gone forever and he spoke her name. She knew precisely what it felt like to have him back when she thought she had lost him. And so her longing for the final reunion was shaped by a memory of one she had already lived. She was waiting to hear her name in that voice again, and she knew, better than anyone, how that would feel. But her grief, like Mary the mother's, was a grief shaped by hope. Because she, more than almost anyone, had reason to believe in the resurrection. She had seen it. She had no doubt that death was not the end, because she had watched a dead man speak her name. So her longing was not hopeless. It was the longing of someone who knew, beyond any doubt, that she would see him again. She had seen him conquer death once. She knew she would be reunited with him in the end. And that knowledge carried her through all the years of missing him. And think about the quiet strength it took to live an ordinary life, carrying such an extraordinary memory. Most of her days were probably unremarkable, the simple business of living, of praying, of serving, of growing older. And yet inside her, she carried the single most extraordinary experience any human being has ever had. She had spoken with the risen Christ. She did not let that memory make her proud, or strange, or detached from ordinary life. She simply lived faithfully, day by day, holding the great memory quietly in her heart, letting it fuel her devotion without letting it lift her out of ordinary, humble life. That is its own kind of greatness, to carry something extraordinary with such humility. If there is one thing that defined how Mary Magdalene lived after Jesus died, it is this. She never stopped being a witness. She had been the first to carry the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she carried it for the rest of her life. Imagine how many times she must have told that story over the years, to new believers, to the curious, to the doubting, to children growing up in the faith. The story of the dark morning, the empty tomb, the figure she took for a gardener, the spoken name, the risen Lord. She would have told it 1,000 times, and every time it would have been as real to her as the morning it happened. Because she had been there. She was not repeating something she had heard. She was telling what she had seen with her own eyes. And her certainty, her unshakable first-hand knowledge, would have strengthened the faith of everyone who heard her. And think about how much her witness mattered, especially in those early years when the whole faith was new and fragile. People were being asked to believe something almost impossible, that a man had risen from the dead, and here was a woman who could look them in the eye and say, "I saw him, I spoke with him, he said my name." The faith of the early church rested in part on witnesses like her, real people who had really seen and who staked their lives on it. Mary Magdalene was one of the great pillars of that witness. She helped hold up the faith in its most vulnerable beginning, simply by faithfully telling what she had seen. And here is something that gives her witness its enormous weight. She had nothing to gain by it, and everything to lose. She was not made rich or powerful by being the first witness. She was not given an easy life. On the contrary, to keep insisting that she had seen a dead man alive marked her out in a hostile world as a target. People do not cling to a story their whole lives at great personal cost for something they know to be false. Mary Magdalene staked everything on what she saw that morning. Her safety, her reputation, her whole life. The fact that she never wavered, never recanted, never quietly let it go, tells us how absolutely certain she was. She had seen him, and she would say so until the day she died, whatever it cost her. And she paid a price for it, almost certainly. To be a follower of Jesus in those early decades was dangerous. The early church was persecuted, believers were arrested, scattered, killed. To keep proclaiming the resurrection was to risk everything. And Mary Magdalene, the first witness, would have lived under that danger and kept witnessing anyway. The love that had kept her at the cross, that had drawn her to the tomb in the dark, now kept her faithful under persecution. She had not abandoned him when it was dangerous at the cross, and she did not abandon him when it was dangerous to follow him afterward. Her courage was of a piece across her whole life. And here is something worth saying clearly, because history has not always been fair to her. For centuries, Mary Magdalene was wrongly remembered as a reformed prostitute, a label found nowhere in the Bible, the result of a later confusion of her with other women in the Gospels. That image is false. The real Mary Magdalene, as the Gospels actually present her, was something far greater. A woman freed from torment. A faithful follower who supported the ministry, the one who stayed at the cross, the first witness of the resurrection, and the first to proclaim it. She was, as the early church called her, the apostle to the apostles, the one sent to tell even the apostles that he was alive. That is who she really was, and that is how she lived the rest of her life, as the faithful witness, not the myth. And so Mary Magdalene lived out her years, faithful, devoted, a witness to the end. And eventually, like all of us, she came to the end of her life. The traditions vary about how and where she died. The Eastern tradition holds that she died peacefully at Ephesus, near Mary the mother of Jesus and the Apostle John, and was buried there with honor. The Western tradition holds that she spent her last years in prayerful solitude in southern France and died there. We cannot be certain of the details, but across the traditions, the picture is consistent. She died in peace, after a long life of faithful devotion, honored by the Church as one of its greatest witnesses. And think about what her death meant for her, given who she was. She, of all people, did not fear death, because she had seen what waited on the other side of it. She had watched a dead man rise. She had spoken with him in the garden. She knew, with a certainty no one else could have, that death was not the end. So for Mary Magdalene, death was not a defeat. It was the long-awaited reunion. It was, at last, going to see him again, the one who had saved her, the one she had followed and grieved and witnessed for all those years. The voice that had spoken her name in the garden would speak it again on the other side. Her whole life after the resurrection had been a long wait for that reunion. And at her death, the wait was over. Step back now and look at how she lived after Jesus died. She did not collapse into her grief, though her grief was real. She did not fade away, though she had lost the center of her world. Instead, she transformed her love into a life of faithful service and witness. She helped build the early church. She told the story of what she had seen again and again for the rest of her life. She remained devoted, faithful, and courageous, under persecution and through old age. She lived the whole rest of her life as a faithful witness to the man who had saved her. And then she went to be with him. And there is a lesson in that, for anyone who has lost someone who shaped their life. Mary Magdalene shows us that the way to honor the people we have loved and lost is not to be destroyed by the loss, but to carry their memory forward into a faithful life, to let our love for them become love for the things they loved, service to the people they cared about, the keeping alive of who they were. She did not move on from Jesus. She carried him with her into a life of devotion that honored him every day. That is how she lived after he died, not by letting go, but by carrying him forward. So what do we take from how Mary Magdalene lived after Jesus died? We take this, that love does not have to die when the person we love is gone. Mary Magdalene loved Jesus with her whole heart, and when he was taken from her, her love did not die. It transformed. It became service, witness, devotion, a faithful life lived in his honor. If you have lost someone you love deeply, Mary Magdalene shows you that your love for them can become something living, a way of honoring them, carrying them forward, letting who they were continue to shape who you are. We take this, that ordinary, faithful life after a great loss is its own kind of heroism. Mary Magdalene had the most extraordinary morning in history, and then she lived decades of ordinary, faithful days. She did not need another miracle to keep believing. She did not need the mountaintop again. She simply lived faithfully, day after day, carrying the memory, serving, witnessing, loving. The quiet faithfulness of her later years is as much a part of her greatness as the resurrection morning. And it is a faithfulness available to all of us. And we take this most of all, that for those who believe, the separation is not forever. Mary Magdalene spent her whole life after the resurrection waiting to see him again. And she lived that wait not in despair, but in hope, because she had seen with her own eyes that death is not the end. If you are missing someone who has gone ahead of you, Mary Magdalene's life holds a quiet promise that the longing is not in vain, that the one who conquered death can be trusted with the ones we have lost, that there is, at the end, a reunion, a voice speaking your name once more. She was the first to see him alive. She spent the rest of her life as his faithful witness, and at the end, she went to see him again. That is how Mary Magdalene lived after Jesus died. With grief, yes, but with greater hope. With longing, but with faithful devotion. Carrying her love for him forward every day, all the way home. If this gave you a new way to see Mary Magdalene, beyond the myths, as the faithful witness she truly was, subscribe. Because we rebuild the human lives behind the Bible and take you inside them. And if you are carrying the loss of someone who shaped your life, tell me in the comments. Tell me who they were. This community walks together. I read every one. Thank you for walking these faithful years with Mary Magdalene and with me. I'll see you in the next one.